Welcome to Our Story Chapter 2. We're going to be talking about important events, historical events that occurred before our ancestors arrived in this country. This chapter is different than the other chapters because we're not going to be talking about ancestors by name, but we're going to be setting the stage for their arrival into this country and what motivated them to make that journey. So you may not always see the connections between what we're talking about and what's coming up. I'll try to point out some of them as we go along, and I think you'll see the relevance of this when we get into the chapters when we can refer back to some of this. So hang on. We're going to be covering about 1,600 years of history in about an hour. Religion, politics, and profit were all interrelated motives for our ancestors and their sponsors. In order to understand these factors that affected our ancestors, we will need to look at the religious landscape, the important trade routes, and the religious and political competition that existed in this time. Before our ancestors came to this country, there were three religions that were competing with each other: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And there was trade going on between Europe and Asia through what was called the Silk Road. This was very important to both economies, and when the Ottoman Empire came into being and expanded across Europe, they threatened to cut off in fact, they did cut off the trade between Europe and Asia. So Europeans' response to that was to start what they called the Age of Exploration, where they would go out, look for other ways to get to that trade, that important trade with Asia, by going around possibly South Africa, southern tip of Africa, or in case of the Spanish and the English, going around the tip of South America. This inspired a bunch of innovation in navigation, in communications, in ship design, that enabled our ancestors to come to this country. And then the Protestant Reformation occurred in the 1500s, and that broke the Christianity up into both the Catholic and the Protestant, and then furthermore it broke the Protestant religion up into a whole bunch of different denominations. All of this was going on, and this was in the background when our ancestors came to this country. We'll explore these topics more as we go through this chapter. Okay, now we got a timeline where we're going to give you kind of an outline of what we're going to be going through in this chapter. We'll start off, Jesus was crucified in 33 AD, and his disciples then started the Christian religion. But by 324 AD, Emperor Constantine had declared Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire, and moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople. Well, this had divided the Roman Empire into an eastern half and a western half, but by 476, the western half had kind of fallen apart, where the eastern half, called the Byzantine Empire, survived. Muhammad started Islam in 622 AD in Mecca. The Vikings were the first to come to America, to North America, in somewhere between 900 and 1000 AD. Marco Polo traveled the Silk Road between 1271 and 1295 and wrote a book about it. Then in 1299, Osman I became the first Sultan of the Islamic Ottoman Empire. And by 1453, the Ottoman Empire had expanded to the point that Mehmed II sacked Constantinople, changed the name again to Istanbul, and declared that that was going to be the capital of the Islamic Ottoman Empire. We know Columbus sailed to America in 1492, and in 1607, our first ancestors came to settle the Jamestown colony. Now, if you look at the map over here on the right, you can see that this is the old walled city of Jerusalem, and it was all that area inside that wall was only about 1/3 of a square mile. And Inside that, you can see another wall, and the top of that wall was what they called the Temple Mount. And back in Jesus' time, that was the site of the Jewish temple. That whole temple complex was destroyed later, and the only thing left was what the Western Wall, which is called the Wailing Wall and sacred to the Jews. Jesus was crucified just outside of that wall, inside the wall of the old city, but outside the Temple Mount wall. There's a church there on that side called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is a pilgrimage that Christians do on Easter every year. But if you went to that place, that site today, you would see that all of the temple is totally gone and something else is in its place. It's called the Islam's Dome of the Rock. Now, if we go over to the left side, you see the Venn diagram of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And if you look in the center part, where all three of them, some things that are common to all three religions, you see they're all monotheistic. Abraham and Moses are important figures. Jerusalem is a sacred place. All three are from this region of the world. They also originated right here. And the Old Testament of the Bible is common to all three religions. If you go over and look at the blue line and the orange line and the intersection of those, you see that the New Testament of the Bible and Jesus are important figures in both Islam and Christianity. So it's kind of hard to understand why there's so much argument and fighting between these three religions. But even furthermore, if you go inside either one of those religions, if you go to Judaism, they're fighting with themselves. They have the ultra-Orthodox, the conservative, the Reform, and the secular Jews. If you go into Islam, they have two distinct divisions, Sunni and Shia, and they are always fighting with each other. And if you go into Christianity, we have the competition between the Catholics and the Protestants. And then when the Protestant church has been divided into many different denominations, which all don't necessarily get along with each other. So now if we go back to Jerusalem in 33 AD, you can see that the figure over here on the left is the Temple Mount, what it looked like at the time. There is the Jewish temple. There is the Western Wall. Now, if you go over to the right side today, you'll see that the site looks totally different. Here you have this golden dome called the Dome of the Rock, which is an Islamic shrine. And underneath that dome is a real rock. And this is supposedly where Muhammad took his night journey in 1621 and was given the revelations that he used to create the Quran, and where he ascended to heaven in 633 AD. So this is the picture we took when we were in Jerusalem a couple of years ago, and there you can see the most prominent thing in Jerusalem today is the Dome of the Rock. Okay, this chart shows you the Roman Empire in 100 AD, and you can see that the Roman Empire extended all around the Mediterranean, into North Africa, into the Arabian Peninsula, over into where Jerusalem is today, and it would be Turkey, and beginning into Central Asia, Eastern Europe, all the way up into Western Europe, and including Great Britain. And you can see now that Jerusalem now is under control of the Romans. The Romans were not Christian. They had a pagan religion with a pantheon of gods. I've got a picture of them up here. So that the Christians and the Jews were being persecuted fairly severely at this time. Now, in 324 AD, Constantine came to power as the Roman emperor, and he moved the capital, like we said, from Rome to Constantinople, and of course that was called Byzantium. He renamed it after himself, Constantinople. And this divided the empire, the Roman Empire, into two pieces. The Eastern Empire, which you see in the pink color, and the Western Empire you see in more of the gold color. The because Constantine had declared the whole Roman Empire to be Catholic before he moved, the whole Roman Empire was Catholic. I mean, you had to be Catholic to survive in the whole Roman Empire at the time. And this time, you can see that Jerusalem was controlled by the Eastern Orthodox Church. But in both empires, the Pope in Rome, or the Patriarch of the Eastern Church, and the priest, that was the only place where you would get information. If the public, this when they went to church, and they had to go to church, they would get whatever information the government and the church wanted them to have. There was no other way to communicate. Now, most of our ancestors were from the Western Roman Empire, and therefore were Roman Catholics at this time. Now, in 622 AD, Muhammad started the Islamic religion in Mecca. And by 620, well, you can see the color coding here shows how the growth of this of the spread of Islam throughout. By the golden color is by about 661. You can have it spread into Egypt, all across the Arabian Peninsula, into Persia, all beginning into the Central Asia. By 750, it had expanded all the way over to North Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula. And what is left, the Christian part, is the purple. You see the Christian Byzantine Empire that was started by Constantine, and then Western Europe now is part of the is Christian, but it's the residue of the old Western Empire, Roman Empire. Jerusalem now is under control of the Muslims. Here's just a picture of every Muslim is supposed to go to Mecca once a year for a pilgrimage, or once in their lifetime for a pilgrimage, and you can see how crowded that would get when that happened. Okay, so what was the reaction to Christianity, to the Jerusalem being captured by the Muslims? Was a series of crusades. These crusades went from about 1096 to 1204. These were actually real armies coming into the Middle East, into trying to overtake Jerusalem, to put it back into Christian control. One of them left from England, others left from what was now called the Holy Roman Empire. And they were never very successful. Occasionally they would be able to hold Jerusalem for a little while, but they never could sustain that. So the result was that Jerusalem stayed in the hands of the Islamic religion. Now, we talked about trade. Well, this is the map of the Silk Road. It went from Venice in Italy all the way over to China, which is probably about where Beijing is today. And it had offshoots all over Central Asia. You wouldn't expect a caravan to take goods all the way from China to Venice. They would go in different pieces. You can see those purple circles, those purple dots. The caravan would go between these major trading centers, and they would take their goods to those trading centers. They would trade for goods coming the other direction and go back and forth. So although there was continuous flow of trade all the way across here, the caravans didn't travel the whole extent of that road of any one caravan. This is maybe a picture you might expect to see of what this might have looked like. We had camels loaded down with goods going along, people walking along with them. Okay, so what were these goods that the Europeans wanted to get from Asia? Silk, obviously. Silk was called the Silk Road. Spices, all kinds of spices. They didn't all come from China. So a lot of them came from what they called the Spice Islands, which was like Indonesia, Philippines area there, but came through China. Tea, the Europeans, particularly the English, liked their tea. Gunpowder. Porcelain, China, porcelain. Kinds of luxury goods that the rich Europeans liked. Oriental rugs. The compass. There was like technology that was coming that way. Compass was invented by the Chinese. Paper was invented by the Chinese. And the printing press was invented by the Chinese. Other things like paper money and coal, they weren't bringing those across the Silk Road, but the ideas, the trade between the East and the West, those ideas, those Asian ideas became popular in Europe as well. And coal is an interesting example. Before this trade was going on, the Europeans would only burn wood to keep warm. But they found out that coal burned a lot longer, gave off a lot more heat, and was a lot better way to keep warm than burning firewood. And so, although coal existed and was available in Europe, they hadn't thought of using it for this purpose. So that started the coal mining industry in England and other places all over Europe and eventually into the Americas. Okay, Marco Polo was the most well-known traveler on the Silk Road. He traveled between 1271 and 1295, and you can see his route here. Started in Venice, went down through the Mediterranean to Jerusalem, got on the Silk Road, went across all through Central Asia and into China. And he became very good buddies with the Emperor of China. In fact, he worked for the Emperor for several years. He lived there. He and his brother lived in China for almost 24 years. And then when they got ready to come home, the emperor gave a letter to Marco and said, I want you to give this letter to the Pope. We want the Pope to send us 100 learned men who would come and teach us about Christianity and Western technology. And so here's Marco Polo going down the Silk Road, or maybe something that looked like Marco Polo. But by the time he came back, because of his relationship with the Emperor of China, he got a ride on a Chinese ship all the way back to Hormuz, where then he picked up the Silk Road and went back into Asia. Well, Columbus read about, Marco Polo had written this book about his travels along the Silk Road and the people he met. And one of the readers of his book a little bit later on was Columbus, who was very impressed with that book, and we'll get to that a little bit more later. Here is a drawing or a painting of Marco Polo meeting with the emperor, and over to the left you see actually a page from his book. And of course, this book at the time in the 1200s was written by hand, and there's a picture of Marco up on the top. Here is the Emperor Kublai Khan. He was the emperor that he went to meet with, and you can see that on the right, or the left, the Ottoman or the Mongol Empire, and on the outline, the red outline there is the outline of China today. You can even see that little jagged line there is where the Great Wall of China was. Now, I started about talking about the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Osman I became the first Sultan of the Islamic Empire in 1299. And I want to say something here. The Ottoman Empire, the emperor was a Muslim, and so the control of the empire, it was an empire. The control of the empire was by the Muslims. However, the policy of the Sultan wasn't that everybody in his empire had to convert to Islam. It was all right, you could be whatever religion you wanted to be. When his army took over the territory, he would say you could keep your religion, keep your local politics and your local way of doing things. You just have to be loyal to him and pay your taxes and don't cause any trouble, and you were fine. So this idea, this way of doing business made them able to expand their empire very rapidly because you didn't have to leave a whole bunch of soldiers everywhere you went to make sure that everybody was practicing the right religion and all that. And the local government was still in place. They didn't destroy the local government and then have to start over with some other higher bureaucracy. So it was a very efficient way to expand an empire. And you can see from about 1299 to 1324, in about 25 years, the empire expanded by a factor of 10. There is the Osman I. And here is what that empire looked like in 1450. You can see that it had taken over almost all of the Byzantine Empire. And the only thing left of the Byzantine Empire was that little purple that you see over there right around where Constantinople is. and this little island off to the west. By 1453, the Ottoman Empire had covered this area that you see here, and you kind of get to see it's color-coded. You can see how the growth if you look at the orange, you can see it's kind of expanding out over what's today Turkey. The light green, or brown, I guess that would be, included most of the rest of Turkey all the way around into Greece and around the Black Sea area. The purple expanded it more further into what would have been the old Byzantine Empire in Eastern Europe, up around the north side into the Black Sea, and down into the finishing up into the Central Asia part. The lighter green then extended it into the Middle East, into Egypt, and to all both sides of the Red Sea, further over into where would be Persia, and over on the other side, all the way around the southern half of the Mediterranean. And then the dark green kind of filled it all the rest of the way in. But, and there is old Mehmed II. Now, by this time, he had actually taken over Constantinople. He had conquered Constantinople, renamed it Istanbul, and declared it to be the capital of the Islamic Empire. And this was then cutting off the trade between Europe and Asia. And according to some of the DNA work that we talked about last time, we possibly do have some Byzantine and Anatolian DNA. So this is a picture that we took when we were in Istanbul a few years ago. This is the Hagia Sophia, and it is was built in 537 as a Christian, Eastern Orthodox Christian, kind of like equivalent to what the St. Peter's is in Rome for the western half of the empire. And it's a very impressive building. It was the biggest dome of its day, and it's still one of the bigger ones. As it withstood earthquakes, over this part of the world is very prone to earthquakes. No earthquake damage even today in this area. So when Mehmed took it over, he converted it to a mosque, a Muslim mosque. Then when the Ottoman Empire fell after World War I, it was converted into a museum, which it was when we visited there. And then this last year, when the more Islamic leadership in Turkey converted it back over to a mosque. So it's had quite a history. And this is what the palace, the Topkapi Palace, that was the head of the Muslim, or the Ottoman Empire. And there's a picture on the right, is the inside of the palace. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. A lot of mosaics, tiles, gold leaf, extremely beautiful place. Now, again, I got to keep reminding you all that the Ottoman Empire was not all Islamic. In fact, there were probably as many Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire as there were Muslims, because they didn't require them to convert. And on the other side of the coin, there were a lot of Muslims that were never part of the Ottoman Empire. So here you can see Africa, for example. You can see that the northern part of Africa is pretty much all Muslim. And by about 900 AD, Islam had expanded all the way down to Somalia, and by 1200 AD, all the way down to Mozambique. Some pictures here of a couple of mosques in Africa that you might run across if you were there. Okay, now we can look at Europe in the 1400s. And you can see that the part you see called the Holy Roman Empire there, and you see the outline of it in red, was this is what's the residue of the old Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire. Now that part of it had been kind of broken up to a whole bunch of little kingdoms and city-states with their own kings. However, they all were Roman Catholic, and they were all kind of under the thumb of the Pope in Rome. In fact, he even picked who was going to be the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, usually one of the local kings that he declared was overseeing all the others. But by now, you can see that France and Portugal, England, Hungary, these other countries were now separate countries with their own kings, England, Scotland, but they all still were Roman Catholic and were still kind of subservient to the Pope. Now there's the Holy Roman Empire. Now there's this little piece down here called Granada, and it was Muslim. It was a Muslim kingdom. And here's Constantinople over here. You can see how they've totally, the Ottoman Empire has cut off that trade that we talked about. It was Byzantium, then it was called Constantinople, and then, of course, now it was, after this, was called Istanbul. And so what happened when the Europeans were cut off from the trade with the East? Well, the first things that happened was the Portuguese. Henry the Navigator was Portuguese, and he started trying to sail down the west coast of Africa, thinking maybe they could get around the southern tip of Africa and over into the Indian Ocean, and they could now begin their trade again with Asia. And he started doing this in the early 1400s, 1434, 1445 he got to here, 1456 he got to here, but he wasn't making much progress. And the reason he wasn't making, or he and the others that were doing the same thing, making much progress was because of the wind that you see in the map over here on the right. When you go down the west coast of Africa and you're going towards the equator from the north, you have favorable winds in the direction you're trying to go. However, when you get down to the equator, you see the wind patterns change, and now you're bucking a strong northerly winds. The ships that they had at the time were not capable of doing that, so it kind of stopped them. Well, the Portuguese started to work on how to solve this problem. Well, they've realized that the winds were a big problem, and they got very serious about mapping winds and the prevailing winds around the parts of the world that they were settling. This map shows a little more than what the Portuguese did, but the idea that you really understand the winds that you're trying to trade in, realize that they're kind of predictable, was a very important step. The next step was the invention of a caravel, which was a more modern kind of a ship that they developed that could sail into the wind, which helps solve that problem. They also put cannon on their ships. They had that gunpowder from Asia. They put cannons on their ships, and this helped them in several ways. One is that now they could defend themselves. They're out exploring the world, going places where they had no idea what they were going to run up against, and so they needed some kind of protection. And then the other thing is when they go into a harbor of a new place, or they would be able to fire off a few cannon balls and kind of wake up the locals, maybe intimidate them a little bit. So it was kind of a good way to get started talking with the natives. But they also did a lot in navigation. They took that compass from the Chinese, mounted it in the ship in a way that it would work when the ship's rocking back and forth. And then they did some other navigation things. There was a thing called an astroblade, which they didn't invent. It had been around a long time. But they could use that to measure at noon of any day, wherever they were on the ocean, the highest point in the sky, the angle to the sun at noon would be the highest that the sun went in the sky. And then from that, they could tell where they were, north and south on the Earth. And if you think of the map you see here, the globe, if you were on the North Pole, then you would see the sun pretty much on the horizon. If you were at the equator, you would see the sun straight overhead. So by knowing that angle, and they had some tables that had calculated those angles for them, they could tell pretty well where they were north-south. And then they could use their compass, and if they were trying to go west, they could try to keep your ship pointed west, but of course you're going to drift north and south because of the winds and the currents and all that. So you could check every day how you were doing. Are you moving north and south when you don't want to? Then you can readjust and keep heading west. So this combination, these new techniques with the new ships, gave them the opportunity now to do what they wanted to. They also were very serious about map making and were very good at it. And they started making very detailed maps of where they went, putting landmarks on that they could use to know where they were exactly and what was there. And these maps were considered state secrets at the time and were very valuable. However, eventually they got out to others as well. But they were the first ones to really go into this in a big way. So now let's talk about the sailing ship. The sailing ship of the day was a old clunky-looking ship that was mainly sailed around in the Mediterranean. It had one sail, fixed sail. You couldn't change the angle of the sail. So they invented this ship called the Caravel. And the Caravel, the thing about it was a lighter ship. It had a more shallow keel, but it also had this triangular sail, as you can see on the back here. And with that triangular sail, you could actually sail into the wind. Now here you can see up here on what I put up here on the right, you can't sail right into the wind. You had to kind of zigzag back and forth, and they call that tacking or beating windward. So if you have that triangular sail up and the wind is going around over the top of it on the backside in this picture, you would create a vacuum behind. You'd have the more air density on the front side than the back, which would push you forward in a direction. But it would be about 45 degrees to the wind. So you go that way for a while, then you roll the sail around so the wind's catching it on the opposite side. It is pushing you back 45 degrees in the other direction, and you keep going back and forth like this, and you can make that zigzagging pattern to sail into the wind. Well, this was a real important thing. So with a combination of the navigation and they were able to sail into the wind, and also those old clunky ships really kind of could only sail right along the coast. Now they were able to go out in the open ocean. They could handle whatever currents they ran into, and they were changeable currents, as you can see from this picture here. So they could sail out, and they did, and they sailed out, and they discovered like the Canary Islands, the Azores, the Madeira, Cape Verde Islands, and they found out that these islands were, the climate on these islands and the terrain on these islands were very suitable for growing sugar, which was a very important cash crop. However, they needed a lot of labor to do this, and the locals weren't particularly good at this. They had not run across Europeans, and they were susceptible to European diseases, and so they were not very healthy. They died very easily. So they brought in African slaves to run these large farms, and this became the plantation system, which was very successful in what they were trying to do, is grow a cash crop, sugar. And this was started then by the Portuguese in the Azores and these other islands. And then that whole concept of the plantation system with African slaves later was imported by the Spanish to the Americas, and then later by the English. So now the Portuguese were able to do what they had wanted to do. By 1498, Vasco da Gama had been able to sail around the tip of South America, Cape of Good Hope, into the Indian Ocean, even all the way over to India. So now they were able to trade. They had made their goal. They were able to trade with Asia. They'd set up trading posts on both coasts of Africa, over in India, and into the what they call the Spice Islands. It was now Indonesia and the Philippines, even all the way up into ports in China. Now, this is a picture. We went to the Cape of Good Hope a few years ago when we were in Africa, and here we are standing at the southern tip of South Africa, right around where Vasco da Gama sailed. Now we're going to talk about the Vikings. They were the first Europeans to explore Europe, the Mediterranean, and North America. They had settlements in Greenland for about 500 years, And they settled North America around the year 1000, but they didn't last very long. They called it Vinland, and there wasn't much there. They decided that it wasn't worth keeping that. They were much better at raiding, so they went on raiding parties all around. And you can see the map over on the right. They explored all over Europe, into the Mediterranean, up around and almost into the Arctic. And so that was well. This map shows the kind of by color the expansion of the exploration by the Vikings. In the 8th century, they kind of hung around Scandinavia. By the 9th century, they had gone over to England and up a couple of places on the northern coast of Europe, and a little bit into Russia, Iceland. By the 11th century, they had expanded all the way up to Greenland, over into Russia, a little bit more on in northern Europe. By the 11th century, that's when they went all around from Greenland over to North America. And then furthermore in England, down into Italy, the boot of Italy and Sicily. And then the green kind of shows that they kind of decided that wasn't really worth it. Better just to raid, and they raided all the way up until the 1100s. All the places that you see in green there, all around Europe, England, Ireland, even along the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, up into Russia. So we do have Viking DNA. Both, if we looked at my mother's mitochondrial DNA, we see that they went up into Finland. And if you look at my father's Y DNA, they migrated up into Norway and Sweden. So surely there's somewhere in our background are some Vikings. Okay, now we're going to talk about specifically the exploration of America, a kind of a timeline. So this is something I'll talk about more, kind of surprising, and is that in the early 1400s, the Chinese were the first to actually go out with their age of discovery before the Europeans did it. Columbus was the first to go, of course, to America. And then in 1497 and 1498, John Cabot, who actually was John Caboboto, was an Italian, but he was under the sponsorship of King Henry VII, so they Anglicized his name. He explored up into eastern, probably up into what Canada would be now today. In 1513, Ponce de Leon was the first to set foot in North America, first Spaniard to set foot in North America, would be when King came to Florida. Of course, he had been beaten out by John by several years, by John Cabot. Then in 1519, Cortez conquered Mexico and discovered all that gold, which really started things moving. Ferdinando Magellan, he was under the sponsorship of Spain, was the first to circumnavigate the earth. He started out with 270 sailors with 5 ships. 3 years later, only 18 sailors on one ship returned to Spain, and Ferdinand Magellan was not among them. He was actually killed in the Philippines about halfway around. Then a little bit later, Hernando de Soto explored southwest portion of what's now the United States and discovered the Mississippi River. So he set out, came into what's today Tampa Bay. He had about 9 ships with 700 men and 220 horses. So they got off and they started going up the coast of, or up the central part of Florida, all throughout Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, up into Arkansas and Louisiana, and down along the Mississippi River. He actually got a fever and died somewhere down the Mississippi River. His men that were left over they built themselves a raft, sailed down or floated, I guess, down the Mississippi River to the Gulf, and then kind of traveled along the Gulf over to Mexico, and eventually found a Mexican community there that one of the colonies that had been set up by the Spanish. But they never returned to Spain. They just basically stayed in the Spanish colonies. Pedro Menendez de Vélez was the first to settle establish a permanent settlement in North America. And of course, that was St. Augustine, Florida. For Francis Drake actually did the same thing that Magellan did, but quite a bit later. But he was sponsored by Queen Elizabeth of England. And the difference is he actually explored up the west coast of America, whereas Magellan went further out to sea. Sir Walter Raleigh had this idea of a colony, a British colony in North America. He called the colony of Roanoke. They had some people that they let off there, came back about a year later to resupply them, and the colony had totally disappeared. So that's why it's called the Lost Colony. Now let's talk about the Chinese. Zhang He was a Chinese eunuch who was in kind of the head of their exploration program. This is not completely agreed upon by historians. Some historians claim that he did all the traveling that you see on the map here. He went all the way, he circumnavigated the world. He went on the east and west coast of America, all over the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, over into Japan, through the Arctic Ocean, up into Greenland. You can see all of this that has happened. And there is some archaeological evidence of this, but it's still in dispute. But there's no question that he sailed all over the Indian Ocean, the South Atlantic Ocean, up the east and west coast of Africa, all around Australia, up into Japan in that area. But however, he came back to the emperor of China, and they said, we've been to all these places. There is absolutely nothing out there that we don't already have. These people are a bunch of barbarians. So the emperor said, well, okay, we were going to close up. We're just going to button up China and hope that they don't come find us. So he had all the ships burned. He passed a law that it would be illegal to build a ship that had more than 2 masts, which meant they could sail around where they were sailing, but not making these long ocean voyages anymore. Now, the secret of the Chinese was that their ships were much larger than the European ships. You can see this is Shanghai's ship, and this is Columbus's ship. The ship was 4.7 times longer. His was 400 feet. Columbus's was 85 feet. And you can see that it's scaled the same way in all 3 dimensions. So the volume that you could carry would be the height times the width times the length, and you multiply 4.7 times 3, you can see that those ships were capable of about 100 times more capability of carrying people, cargo, water, everything you needed. So those ships would be capable of sailing all the way around the world without being resupplied, whereas a small ship like Columbus would run out of water and supplies within a couple thousand miles. If he couldn't resupply, then everybody was going to die. So it was certainly possible and capable for the Chinese to do everything that we showed on the map before. One thing that it's documented that they did was they went around Africa. They brought all these exotic animals back for the emperor, and they set up a zoo, and that kind of impressed him. But you can see now, today, if you would go to Nanjing Harbor in China, they actually have built a full-scale replica of one of Shanghai's ships. And now, let's think about what was going on. We've already talked about the Portuguese and what they did in response to getting their trade routes cut off. Well, what did the Spanish do? Well, here we have a picture of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Ferdinand was the king of the Kingdom of Aragon, and Isabella was the queen of Castile and Leon. They married in 1474 and formed the country of Spain, the Kingdom of Spain. A little bit problem for them was there's this Kingdom of Granada, I guess you might say, out down here, that was an Islamic kingdom. And you can see that Portugal is right next door, and there was a lot of competition between Portugal and Spain, and Portugal had already gone out and done their discoveries and at least been able to way to get around Africa. Spain was kind of way behind. So you can see now by 1492, Spain was one big country. They'd kicked out the Grenadians. And when they did that, they gave them an opportunity. They said, you can stay here if you will convert to Catholicism. But if not, you have to leave. Well, many of the Muslims and Jews that were there left and went to the Ottoman Empire. They were a lot of very highly educated, talented people, and they were welcomed in the Ottoman Empire because they didn't have this requirement that everybody had to be Islamic. In fact, the doctors for the Sultan from then on were mostly Jewish doctors. So this was a real brain drain for the Ottomans and at a loss for the Spanish. And you've probably heard of the Spanish Inquisition. Well, this is when this was going on, because they were finding people they thought that they claimed that they had converted, but they thought they hadn't. If they hadn't, they were up to some serious trouble. Now, we do have, at least like I said, if we go back to our DNA, they found it in various points in time that we had some Iberian DNA as well. Now let's go to the Alhambra, which was the big headquarters of the Granadian Empire, or not empire, was a kingdom there. That was in southern Spain. It was taken over by the Spanish. And Queen Isabel had a real hatred for Muslims, and she died in 1504, and she decided that she wanted to be buried right in the center of this palace because she thought somehow this would keep the Muslims from coming back. However, they moved her a little bit later in 1521. They moved her to a cathedral that was built in Granada, and so she didn't really stay there. However, she was very clear in her instructions before she died that she wanted to continue to get rid of the Muslims in North Africa and have a crusade, a successful crusade to get them out of Jerusalem. Now, Columbus knew about her situation, and so this is one of the reasons that he came to pitch his idea to her, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But this book that I've got down here at the bottom is, I read this book. It's a very good book talking about the Ottoman Empire and the impact of the Ottoman Empire on our ancestors' immigration to the States, and I highly recommend it if that's of any interest to you. So now we're talking about Christopher Columbus. And he was an explorer, a navigator. He made 4 voyages to Americas, and we all know that. But he never actually set foot in North America. He came to the Caribbean in all 4 of his trips. He was a quite religious man. He read a lot about the Crusades, and he also read Marco Polo's book. And he thought that he could get to Europe, or get from Europe to Asia by settling westward. They knew that already that the Portuguese had gone the other way, and that wasn't going to work for them. So this was a new idea that was worth looking into. But he believed when he read Marco Polo's book and part about Khan wanting to have some people to come and teach him about Christianity, he thought that he had some descendants that were still there. He could find those descendants, convert them to Christianity, and then they could attack the Ottoman Empire both from the east and the west with the help of the Chinese. And so this was part of his plan. The other part was, of course, to sail over to Asia from the west. He didn't have a very good understanding of the size of the earth. He thought the distance from the Azores to Japan was a little over 2,000 miles. But it turns out it's really 12,000 miles. So he set out. Well, fortunately for him, there was the American continent in the way, because it was about 2,000 miles away, and that was about as far as he could sail in his ships without running out of supplies. So he, in fact, every time that he went in all 4 trips, he still insisted that he was exploring some islands off the coast of Asia. Here he is, a picture of him pitching his story to the queen, king and queen, saying, okay, give me some money. I will go out. I will find you a trip to Asia. On the way, I'll discover other lands that you can use to profit Spain, and we will get rid of the Muslim problem. And so that was his pitch, and I guess they bought it because they funded him to do this. In fact, here's a picture of the book, Marco Polo's book. By this time, it was being printed on the Gutenberg printing press. And you can see the notes that Columbus had in that book about his plans, how he was going to use that. Now here's his three ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And you can see they all use that lateen sail that was invented by the Portuguese 50 years ago, or before that. Here are the routes that he took in the 4 different trips. You see they all went around into the Caribbean islands. In the 4th trip, he went all over to Central America, somewhere around Panama. And at that point, you can see that he was actually only about 50 miles from the Pacific Ocean. Of course, he didn't know that. Here's a picture of him conquering one of those islands, probably Hispaniola, for the Spanish. So this is the kind of what the Europeans did. They'd come on, they'd plant the flag, and they say, we conquered this land for the king of Spain in this case, or whatever. Somehow that was supposed to give them access to all this land, kind of ignoring the fact that it was already populated by Native Americans. Now, okay, so we now had this issue with the Portuguese going out and starting going around to the east, and the Spanish kind of going around to the west, and they're beginning to think about colonizing these different parts of the world. You can see this is going to continue to be a problem. So they went to the Pope, and the Pope, of course, both the countries were Catholic. They're right next door to each other. And the Pope drew this line. If you look at the map up on the top right, you can see that orange line that goes through Greenland. Well, the Pope just drew this line and said, okay, everything to the east of the line, Portuguese can colonize as long as they weren't already Christian. Everything to the west was fair game for the Spanish. So you draw the lines on the map you see at the bottom, they're curved lines. And they had this treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas, where they decided that if the line should be moved a little bit, and it was the purple line. And you see that purple line actually extends over the eastern part of South America. So this gave the Portuguese the opportunity to settle what now became Brazil. But that didn't really answer all the questions, because what happens if you go around the other side of the world? And so they had another treaty of Saragossa where they drew what is the green line on the map. And that green line was like actually 180 degrees around the world from the blue line, a purple line. So you can see everything in the western half of the world was now free for the Spanish. Everything in the eastern half was free for the Portuguese. And this treaty held up. So now we got what we call the Age of Discovery, where everybody's going out and trying to colonize the world as fast as they can, particularly the Portuguese and the Spanish. So you can see the pink color is where the Portuguese colonized, and they didn't always colonize. Sometimes it was just little trading posts. But you can see, of course, they got Brazil. They got all up and down both coasts of Africa with their trading posts, a little bit of India there, and over into the Spice Islands, which are now Indonesia. And I drew the lines, both the east and the west line, so you can see the kind of the boundaries for both cases on this map. And you see this little pink spot over here in China. That is Macau. That became a Portuguese colony, and it remained a Portuguese colony until 1999, when it was actually turned back over to mainland China. You can see now Spain is the gold color. Spain took over the western part of South America, all of Central America, and up into Mexico, and even up into North America. They didn't really colonize it so much as they built missions all along the western part of North America, where they were just trying to convert people to Christianity. Now you look at what the British were doing at the time. The British, all they had managed to do by this time was to colonize, if you want to call it that, Ireland. And then just a little bit later, the French came along and they started colonies up in what today is eastern Canada. Okay, this is looking now at a map of the colonization of America by the Spanish. And of course the Portuguese. That orange, the yellow goldish part is the Portuguese. And so this was spearheaded by what the Spanish called the conquistadors. Their main motive was profit, opportunity to spread Catholicism to the indigenous people because they were still worried about Islam over in Europe and the spread of Islam, and they were trying to get more. We need more Christians. Their profits they came from the plantations that they built for different crops like sugar and coffee and things like that, and mining. They found quite a bit of gold and silver in South and Central America. And of course, they had labor problems, which they solved with slave labor from Africa. Now, kind of to take you to the other end of that colonization story, if you go all the way up to 1898, you can see that all of the part of South America, which was colonized by the British or by the Spanish and the Portuguese, became independent countries. And the same way with Central America and the Mexico. None of those remained Spanish. And so the whole Spanish Empire had collapsed by 1898. Now, another thing that happened because of this colonization of Americas, really a big important thing, is what was called the Columbian Exchange. And here you can see that there was trade going on back and forth, and the colonists in America found out there were a lot of things in America that they didn't have in Europe. There was tobacco, there were sweet potatoes, there were turkeys, there were peppers and tomatoes and potatoes and corn and things like that. And the two things that really stand out to me were the potato, because the potato had the capability, if you planted an acre of potatoes versus an acre of wheat, you could feed several times as many people. So the potato became kind of the crop particularly in Northern Europe, in England, Scotland, Ireland, and other places in Northern Europe, to feed the people, the poorer people. Now an acre of land could feed more people than it could before. They could have more children. This created a population explosion, and that was part of the forces that made our ancestors come to America. And the other thing is the tomato. I can't imagine Italy without tomatoes, with all their tomato sauce for their pastas and things like that. Now, going the other direction, there were a lot of things that they had in Europe that weren't available or that hadn't existed in the Americas. The coffee bean, citrus fruit, all sorts of fruit, bananas, sugar cane, grapes. But probably one of the biggest was livestock. No cattle, sheep, pigs, or horses were in the Americas. They were all brought in by the Europeans. And the horse particularly was important later on to the Native Americans in North America. When we were starting to fight with them over land in North America, the horses were a big deal. But unfortunately, another thing that was imported from Europe to Asia were diseases. And because the Native Americans had not been exposed to any of these European diseases. And the reason for that I've read is that the Europeans had domestic animals. They had all this livestock, they had chickens and things like that. So they were living right in close proximity to these animals. These animals were domesticated, they had to feed them, and they had to deal with them all the time. So a lot of those diseases had jumped from the animals to the humans. And this had been going on for years and years and years. So the Europeans had developed some immunity to these diseases. Not complete, but enough that they weren't being totally destroyed by it. Whereas it's estimated that about 90% of the Native Americans in both North and South America died over the next 100 years of these European-induced diseases, which was another big factor for the success of our ancestors immigrating to America. Now, this picture, it's really talking about the slave trade, but it has another purpose that I'm using it for. You can see, well, of course, you can see all the trade, where the slaves were imported from, and how many, relatively speaking. Most of them, you can see, went to the West Indies, to the Caribbean, but a lot of them went to Brazil. So those are the two biggest users of slaves. 500,000 into South America, 200,000 into Central America, 500,000 into North America. But you can see these symbols on the map as well, showing what was going on. How were they profiting by all of this? And you can see where the mines were, or the kind of the pick and the shovel there. And then you can see the different crops: the sugar, the coffee, the rice, the tobacco. And so this was all going on. So our ancestors learned a lot of lessons from this early exploration. They learned that they could make money by doing this. They learned there was gold in the Americas, and they knew that they needed slaves to run these plantations. And so they brought in slaves all over the place, as you can see from this map. Now, there was a consequence to that, other than all the good things they just, for them anyway, not for the slaves, but for them. Spain was, they were trying to get away from Muslims in Europe. That's one of the points, that's one of the reasons they were doing all this. But they inadvertently brought Muslims into the Americas by the fact that a lot of these slaves they were bringing in, as you can see from the maps that we showed you of Africa, were Muslims. And they were the ones who led a lot of the revolts, the slave rebellions, slave uprisings that took place in South America, and then a little bit later even in some in North America. So these Muslim slaves were much more educated and skilled slaves than some of the other slaves they got from other places in Africa. So this Muslim uprising, the first one occurred in 1522 in a place called in Hispaniola, which is today is the island that's split up between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And the other kind of ironic part of this is that Columbus's son was the governor of Hispaniola at the time of this early revolt. But Spain had already had a law on the books that said an infidel, which they described as Jewish, Protestant, or Muslim, could not come into the Spanish colonies. And of course, they'd been fighting with the Islamic Empire. That was the motivation between a lot of this in the first place. So they didn't want any Muslims coming in. They brought them in themselves. But the slave traders largely ignored this ban on the Muslims because the Muslim slaves were more educated and more skilled and therefore more valuable. So they came in anyway. John Cabot, he was actually a Viennese named Juan Convito, but he had some connection with England. He had some kind of dual citizenship thing I didn't quite figure out. So he was considered the first Englishman to actually set foot on North America in 1497. So he sailed up into the area we would call now, and they were looking for this Northwest Passage to Asia. That's still a big deal. And he was probing around in Newfoundland, kind of ran low on supplies and running out of good weather, and then finally sailed back to England. His son, Sebastian Cabot, the next year kind of followed his father's lead. There he is. And he sailed up into pretty much the same place that John had gone. And he was also being sponsored by King Henry VII. So he sailed up and up the north of Labrador, went into the Hudson Bay. And this was a huge open water area that he couldn't tell the difference between that and something that was headed to Asia. So he got kind of excited. But he was getting into a bad time of the year. It was getting cold up there, icebergs, things like that. So he turned around and sailed down the east coast of North America. And he sailed all the way down by the spring of 1509. He actually sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, which is 100 years later where our first Jamestown ancestors went. So he he saw all of this stuff. He saw the fisheries off the coast of Labrador. He saw all this land and not many people. He's all met with few. And so he came back to England all excited about what he had found, but found out that King Henry VII had died. And then he went to get an audience with King Henry VIII, his successor, and Henry VIII there was no interest whatsoever in all of this, in this American continent and all that, pretty much ignored him, and that was the end of that. So the English really had an opportunity to get on board with this colonization and been right in there at the same time the Spanish were settling in South America, but they dropped the ball. It was 70 years later before Francis Drake actually came back and was set foot in North America again. So here's Sir Francis Drake, and he repeated what Magellan had done about 50 years earlier, and followed pretty much the same path. And he was now being sponsored by Queen Elizabeth of England. So Francis Drake was kind of a character. He was a naval officer, a sea captain, a slave trader, and a pirate. And one of his little tricks he did as a pirate was he liked to kind of hang around out in the Atlantic. When he saw one of these Spanish galleons loaded with gold to go back to Spain, he would intercept them. His pirates would take over the ship, would steal all of the gold and take it back to England and present it to Queen Elizabeth. And after a few of these trips, she got to like him a lot. So she was the one who said, okay, I'll fund your trip around the world. Maybe you'll find something else real interesting for me. And so he went around, followed the same path pretty much that Magellan did, except when he got around the tip of South America, instead of going out in the open ocean, he sailed all the way along the coast of South America. And he stopped and probed around several times. Then he went into Central America and up the west coast of North America, stopped in some place, probably in Northern California, got off, looked around, and then headed out to finish his trip. So he was the second person on English sponsorship to actually step foot in North America. And this was probably 200 years before the next English person or English speaking person viewed the west coast settled on the west coast of North America, and that would have been Lewis and Clark. Now, the last one I want to talk about here is Henry Hudson. He had kind of a tragic story, but this was a little bit later. This was in 1609 through 1611. So on his first trip, which is the red one you see here, again, he's looking for this way to get to Asia. The first thing he does is he says, well, maybe I can go east over the northern Europe. But he went up into the Arctic and got into some trouble with ice and things, and it didn't look like that was going to work. So he turned around and sailed back into to America, around Nova Scotia. He went down to Cape Cod, explored that. That looked interesting. Then he went up the Chesapeake Bay, again, where our ancestors went. Then he sailed up into the Hudson River, and all the way up the Hudson River and back down. And then he went back to Europe. And so this was successful. So they gave him another trip, and he went up again. Went a little bit further north this time, kind of more like where Cabot went, and went into the Hudson Bay. And again, he got the same reaction. This looks like a real possibility. But it was getting cold in the wintertime, so he went down to the very southern tip, and he and his crew wintered down there. Then in the next spring, he was ready to go sail westward and try to find this elusive Northwest Passage. However, his crew had had enough. They mutinied. They kicked him, his son, and the 7 senior officers on his ship, and just dumped them off and sailed away. And Henry and none of his people that were left with him ever were heard from again. So this wasn't a kind of a tragic end for him, but he got the Hudson River and Hudson Bay named after him, so I guess in the long run, maybe not so bad. Okay, well, I think these four people that you see here had as much to do with getting our ancestors over to America than anything else. And they were leaders in different areas. There was Johannes Gutenberg, who was more of a technical guy, or communication technical guy for getting us started with the printing press. And then Henry the Navigator, who we've already talked about, made a lot of contributions to the naval technologies and navigation technologies. And then from the religious perspective, Father Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, which really was a major shift in the religious situation in Europe. And then from the political perspective, Henry VIII, who separated England from the Catholic Church. We'll start off with Gutenberg. Before we already mentioned that the printing press was invented in China, maybe even the 1200s, but it wasn't known in Europe. And so Gutenberg in 1444 developed the printing press in Europe. And he started printing Latin Bibles on the printing press. Well, that didn't help much, because the only people who could read Latin were the priests. So we're back to the priest in charge of everything already. You can see down at the bottom on the right what a book looked like in Europe, before the printing press. They were all done by hand by monks in monasteries, and it might take a year to make one book. You can see up on the upper right where the expansion of books in Europe by century, from the 15th century to the 18th century. So it was a major impact on communications for Europe and for the rest of the world, for that matter. And many of our ancestors were literate and were reading these books, and it motivated them to do what they finally went ahead and did. Okay, Martin Luther was a German professor of theology, a priest, an author, a composer, and a monk, and the seminal figure in the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, Martin attached a letter to the Archbishop of Mainz on the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral, criticizing the practices of selling indulgences, and also questioning other authorities of the Pope. He had 10,000 of these letters circulated throughout Europe using the Gutenberg printing press, and they created quite a stir across Europe. Well, basically, by purchasing an indulgence, an individual could reduce the length and severity of punishment that heaven would require for them as payment for their sins. So you could buy an indulgence from the Pope for himself or for a loved one, and they would go to heaven and not burn in hell. So this was, pretty good story, and it was pretty lucrative. Now here is a copy of that you can see over here, and there's the printing press that was printed on. So you can see how the printing press comes together with the religious movement that was going on at the time. Okay, Martin had a couple of very specific complaints about the selling of indulgence. Pope Leo wanted to generate some money so he could build, his two favorite projects were building of St. Peter's Cathedral, and the other was funding another crusade to stop the Ottoman advance into Europe, and also to continue to try to recover Jerusalem for the Christians. Well, Martin Luther was against selling indulgence in general, but he thought these two projects were more for the glory of the Pope than the glory of God. He thought that the basilica was extravagant, and the money could be used much more in a more Christian way by helping the poor and things like that. And then he said there was no need to have this crusade because, in his opinion, the reason that the Ottoman Empire was encroaching on Europe was because of the corruption in the church, and God was punishing the Christians for the corruption in the church, and if they were to clean up the corruption, somehow the Muslims would the Ottomans would just turn around and go home. So he obviously didn't understand what was going on with the Ottoman Empire, but this idea of having God punish God punish Christians for corruption in the church or of their true church was an idea that came up again and again, and we're going to revisit that idea when we talk about the Puritans in New England in a couple more chapters. So here is Luther's trial. So Luther, of course, the Pope had him excommunicated, and then he had to go to trial, and the trial was more of the Holy Roman Empire trial, where he had to go before the court, and he would not recant what he had said in his letters, so he was considered an outlaw, and even the court even said it would be a crime for anyone to feed him or house him or help him in any way. And in fact, they said that it would be all right if you killed him. There wouldn't be any legal consequences for that. Well, somehow the Emperor Frederick III, he was the present emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He must have had some sympathy for Luther, maybe believed some of the same things Luther was saying, because he actually had Luther kidnapped and brought into his castle. And he kept him there for a while till things cooled down and under his protection. And during that time, Luther translated the Bible into German, the local language, and had many copies made on the Gutenberg press. So he also said that the Bible was the Word of God, and therefore, if you could read the Bible for yourself, you didn't need a priest to tell you what it said, now that it was in German, and that everybody could interpret their own way. Well, this was an extremely radical idea, and it was because this kind of got the church out of the loop. So a lot of the local kings and people were kind of like this idea because they were not happy with the Catholic Church, the corruption in the church, and the fact that the merchants had to pay taxes to the church, and that the kings were kind of jealous that the church had so much more money than their little kingdoms had. So this wasn't an altogether unpopular idea at the time. So, but this really opened up a big Pandora's box because, as you can imagine, everybody started reading the Bible for themselves. They didn't all get the same interpretations from the Bible. And this kind of started spinning off a bunch of different little Protestant Christian sects that didn't even agree with each other. And this fighting between the different Protestant groups and the Protestants and the Catholics has been going on ever since. There is a copy of the German Bible that was printed on the printing press. Okay, well, here's Henry VIII. His big concern was that he wanted a male heir, and he had married Catherine of Aragon in 1533, and she was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. By 1533, she had not produced a male heir. So Henry wanted to get the marriage annulled and marry Anne Boleyn. Pope Clement would not grant the annulment, so Henry just went ahead and married Anne anyway. This got him excommunicated from the Catholic Church, and kind of following Luther's lead, he just said, okay, well, I am going to just disband the Catholic Church in England. I'm going to start my own church called the Church of England, and also sometimes called the Anglican Church, and I'm going to be the head of the church. So he did. This is what started the English Protestant Reformation. Well, Anne didn't produce a male heir either, and so he had her executed for some trumped-up charges. So then he married his third wife, Jane Seymour, in 1636, and she did produce a male heir, King Edward the Sixth. But she died. She died a year later. Then he married Anne of Cleves, and she didn't last more than a few months. They divorced her. Then he married Catherine Howard. She lasted 2 years before he had her executed. And finally, he married Catherine Parr, who actually outlived him. So this whole thing about the heir, the male heir, Yeah, he finally got the male heir from Jane Seymour, but he was only 9 years old when he came on the throne and died by age 15. So he really wasn't very consequential in the scheme of things to follow. However, Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, they had a daughter named Mary, who became the Queen of England after Henry, or after Henry's son Edward died. And then she died. Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth, became the next queen. So those two women produced the next two queens that actually lived long enough to do some things and change the course of history, really. So all his worry about the son was kind of for naught. So the English Protestant Reformation. Henry, he married Anne, got excommunicated, and then he separated, as we said. But everybody didn't go along with this right away. So there were a lot of Catholics. Everybody was Catholic, really, at the time. So he really went after it with a vengeance. He confiscated all the Catholic monasteries and churches and all their properties. And then the people that were still not going to go along were treated very harshly, to say the least. They were burned at the stake. They were tortured. And so you had to go along with Henry or become a Protestant, or you're not going to have a very happy life in England at the time. Now, this Protestant Reformation was really a key factor, and you'll see this as we go along, probably the major factor in most of our ancestors coming to America. And our 11th great-grandfather, Nicholas Corey, was living in England during Henry VIII's reign. So this is kind of a summary of what people were concerned about and why this Protestant Reformation, both in Germany by Luther and in England by Henry, really kind of stuck, and it was kind of welcomed by many people. The social values in the Renaissance era, this was the kind of the Renaissance period, if you remember that from your history. Humanism, secularism, questioning of the church was all going on by these philosophers of the time. And the printing press, of course, we said, helped spread all that to the masses. And the kings were kind of tired of having the Pope challenge their authority. And if you weren't in Italy, people would thinking of the Pope as kind of a foreign authority that was sticking his nose into their business. Economically, they were jealous of the church's wealth and wanted some of that for themselves. And the merchants didn't like paying the taxes. And it was very clear that the church had become corrupt, and was not a big surprise. And this idea of selling indulgence was not considered acceptable to a lot of people, including Martin Luther. Okay, we're going to follow on with the English monarchs that followed Henry VIII and see how they reacted to this Protestant Reformation. The first one was Bloody Queen Mary. She was called Bloody because she was the daughter of Henry and Catherine of Aragon, and she was a Catholic, and she decided that the official Church of England would be Catholic. Of course, now we had people that had to become Protestants or get killed. Now they had to convert back to Catholicism or be killed, and she was serious about it. She had Protestant archbishops and other church officials burned at the stake. And during when all this was going on, our 10th great-grandfather, John Corey, was living in England. When she died, her half-sister, Queen Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, took the reign, and she was a Protestant, so everything went back to the Protestant side. So all this people that had become Protestant and then had to become Catholic to stay alive now had to be Protestant again. And she actually oversaw the defeat of the Spanish Armada, which we will discuss in a bit, and funded the establishment of the Roanoke colony, the lost colony of Roanoke. and she funded Sir Francis Drake's explorations of America. And our ninth great-grandfather, Nicholas Corey, was there during her reign. Then the next one was King James the First, and he was a Protestant, but there were still a lot of Catholics around in England that were trying to get Catholic back on the throne. So they had this plot called the Gunpowder Plot that they were going to blow up Parliament on the first day they met in 1605. But the king and his people found out about this before it happened, so they infiltrated them, and it didn't happen. But that didn't mean the king wasn't going to retaliate. He really went after the Catholics with a vengeance after that. Later, he authorized the new translation of the English translation of the Bible called the King James Version, and said, this is it, this is the official and only Bible to be used in England. He also authorized the Virginia Company, which was the in America that actually was responsible for the founding of Jamestown. And all of our Jamestown ancestors came in during his reign. And our eighth great-grandfather, also named Nicholas, was in England during his reign. Now, King Charles came along after that. He was also a Protestant, but he married a Catholic, Henrietta Maria of France. And he followed the line of King James, and this, the official Church of England was the right church. But by this time, other Protestant denominations were coming into being and disagreed with this. They called themselves Puritans, and they actually created an uprising against him, which had led to the English Civil War, and he was beheaded in 1649. When he was beheaded, the Puritan leader of the opposition, Oliver Cromwell, became Lord Protector. He wasn't a king. 58% of all of our ancestors, including our sixth great-grandfather, Thomas Corey, immigrated to the United States during Charles' reign. Now, after Oliver Cromwell came along, he was a Puritan, like I said. We'll talk about Puritans and what that meant in a bit. But Puritans actually they wanted to purify the church, and they thought it was still too Catholic under the Church of England's leadership. And there was another group of Protestants that that came into being after the Protestant Reformation, called Presbyterians, and mainly they were in Scotland, and he didn't like them either. They weren't Puritans. He discriminated against them. He discriminated against everybody except Puritans. So this became especially a problem for the Scotch and the Irish, and a lot of our early Scotch and Irish ancestors came in during his rule. But after his death in 1658, the monarchy was reestablished by King Charles II, son of King Charles I. So he was a Protestant, and the King of Scotland and Ireland, as well as England. And he was the son of, like I said, King Charles I, so he kind of put King Charles's people back on the throne. He was Protestant. And he was followed by King James II, and you won't believe it, but King James II was a Catholic. So we got a Catholic back on the throne. Now everything started going the other way. Well, this caused a lot of trouble, and they had something called the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which permanently ended the possibility of a Catholic monarch, and also at the same time kind of clipped the wings of the king and took away some of his power. Parliament was getting more power, and the king was getting less power during his reign. Then the last one we're going to talk about is Henry. You've heard of or William and Mary, or the college William and Mary. Well, King William and Queen Mary came into power. They ruled together. They were Protestants, and they ruled until her death in 1694, and William continued to rule until his death in 1708. We'll hear more about King James, William, and Mary when we talk about our ancestors in Massachusetts, because some of their decisions actually had a major impact on the colonies and what the people were living in the colonies and how they could run their colonies at the time. So we'll get back to them in a bit. Well, the Spanish Armada was another big turning point that was necessary, really, for our ancestors to come to America. We know that the Catholic Queen Mary was on the throne. She was actually married to King Philip II of Spain, And so the king thought he had it all sewed up that England was going to stay Catholic. But she died, Mary died in 1558, and Queen Elizabeth came on the throne, as we just mentioned. She was a Protestant, Elizabeth was a Protestant. So first thing that Philip did was think maybe he could marry Elizabeth. She wouldn't have anything to do with that. So he said, well, the next best thing he could do was attack England and invade England and put a Catholic king or queen on the throne in England, bring England back into the Catholic fold. So he built a fleet of 130 very large ships, had 18,000 soldiers, 8,000 sailors, and 180 priests, and sailed for England. Now, the English Navy was smaller. It wasn't as big as the Spanish Navy. But it had smaller ships. They were more maneuverable, and they had longer range guns, and they had some pretty smart admirals. So they came. So they were ready for the Spanish when they showed up. And I'm going to kind of walk you through this. So they came in. They left Spain in July the 12th of 1588. Arrived in the coast of England in 19th of July. And the first thing that the English Navy does is they kind of chase them into the English Channel. And you can see the English Channel there is a very small, narrow waterway. And these great big ships, 130 of them coming in there all at once, got very, very crowded. And they couldn't maneuver. They were just kind of locked in there, kind of like a gridlock. And so then what the English did was one of the things they did was they'd had some of their old ships, they'd set them on fire and then let the wind blow them into this whole group of Spanish ships, and that would set them on fire, and they were so close together, one on fire would get another one on fire, and this was a very effective technique that they used. And you can see my arrows down here show you the numbers associated with each one of these little notes, where they are when this is going on. So now we're up to 4. Then now the English, they've got them all locked into the English Channel. They've got ships on the west, ships on the north. So they're kind of doing this pincer thing, squeezing them in, and just standing off enough to use their longer guns to shoot at the Spanish ships. It's very effective. So by this time, the Spanish, well, they did have, if you look at number 6 there, they had 30,000 soldiers on land in what this was in the Netherlands now, that was under the control of Spain at the time, that were ready to, as soon as the Armada got some kind of control of the English Channel, they were going to cross the Channel, come into southern England, and join up with the soldiers that are on the ships. But they couldn't do that because the Channel was so crowded with all these ships and the things were on fire and all that, so that never happened, and that was good for the English. So they decided they needed to get back to England, or back to Spain, so they started sailing around England from the north side. They didn't want to go back through the Channel, so they came around the north of Scotland and came up into, we see number 8 there. And there was a tremendous storms. It may even have been a hurricane that came up, and at the time, and the ships were wrecked, sunk, and so between the fires and this, by the time the English or the Spanish got headed back to Spain, they had lost over half of their ships. So this kind of brought an end to the dominance of Spain on the Atlantic. And this was very important because the English, when they decided to come and settle North America, Jamestown and Massachusetts and those other colonies, they needed to have fairly free access across the Atlantic to bring those people in, supply them, resupply them, and get trade going between the colonies and England. So the Spanish Armada was a very big factor in allowing all this to happen. And the other thing that, if you just want to think about it for a minute, had the Spanish won, had Spain been able to invade England, put probably a Spanish king or queen on the throne, very likely we would all be speaking Spanish today, and all of America, North America, would be Spanish instead of English. So this was a biggie. The fact that English were able to win in beat the Spanish Armada. Now here we've got a political map of Europe of 1600. So now we're kind of setting things up for this is just a few years before we started colonizing. The English started colonizing North America. The Ottoman Empire was still the biggest empire in the world. They were growing. They had blocked off the routes through land routes to Asia, and were quite a threat to Western Europe. Spain was its own country now. It was the Kingdom of Spain that combined Aragon and Castile. Portugal, right next door, was another kingdom. France was another kingdom. And England, they had the Kingdom of England, the Kingdom of Scotland, and then there was this whole group of countries in the middle here called, turned out to be called still the Holy Roman Empire. So this is just the residue of the original Western Roman Empire. It was made up of a bunch of little kingdoms, kind of loosely connected together. But everybody in all of those kingdoms, except for, of course, the Ottomans, were still Roman Catholic and were still under the thumb of the Pope. So the Pope actually, in the Holy Roman Empire, he was able to pick what the person they called the Holy Roman Emperor, who was one of the kings, one of the local kings that he would give the title of Holy Roman Emperor and had some power, I guess, over the other emperors. But all the power really came from the Pope. And all these other countries, England, France, Spain, Portugal, and so forth, were Catholic countries. Therefore, they were still also under the control of the Pope. All right, now what did the religious situation look like in Europe at the time? Well, this map shows the different colors. You see that the colors represent different religions that were the dominant religions in these different countries. The Lutherans are in yellow. The Presbyterians are in kind of a turquoise or blue-green color. The Church of England is purple. Roman Catholic is white. The pink is Orthodox. That would have been originally people that were of the Eastern Orthodox Christian religion and now are called Russian Orthodox. So that's still remaining from the days of the Byzantine Empire. And of course, the kind of the orangish color are the Ottomans. And so you can see kind of the layout of Europe. So now, go back to the Lutherans. Well, that was, Martin Luther. He was right there in the center of the Holy Roman Empire. So his influence really spread around. So probably half, you can see the kind of the brown outline there is the outline of the Holy Roman Empire. Maybe a third of that was Lutheran by this time. And then the rest of it was a little bit of Protestant and mostly Catholic. So it kind of split up between the two. A lot of friction between those different religions in the Holy Roman Empire at the time. And then also Norway, Sweden, all of Scandinavia had become Lutheran. England was Church of England, King Henry's church. And then Scotland and a little bit of the Netherlands, Denmark, a few other little spots were Presbyterians. And Presbyterians, somewhat like the Puritans, were another Protestant sect that was not happy with the Church of England, but were still Protestants. And so we'll talk more about the Protestants, and particularly the Puritans and the Presbyterians a little bit later. So I've got a religion tree. And we've talked about the beginning of this. We talked about Judaism and then Jesus and then the Catholic Church coming into being in the Roman Empire. And then that splitting between the Western and the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic. Then we talk about Martin Luther and the forming of, spinning off of Lutheranism. Then a little later, Henry VIII started the Church of England, and then spinning off from the Church of England, there were the Puritans. We talked about them a bit. We'll talk about them a lot more. And the Quakers, and the Presbyterians,
and the Methodists, and several others. But the ones I've circled are people that were actually our ancestors, that were different ones of our ancestors were parts of those different groups, particularly the Protestant groups that we see here. Oh yeah, and Baptists. Now this is kind of the way the world religions look like today. The color coding represents different religion dominance in different parts of the world. And the blue is Protestant, the red is Catholic, and the green is Muslim. So those are still, well, there's also the Jews, but we'll talk about them in a minute. So the Protestants, you can see that kind of what the striking thing here is if you look at where the blue is, you can see that's in North America, a lot of Canada, the Scandinavian countries, Britain. If you look at where the red is, it's Mexico, Central America, South America, all of most of Europe, particularly the southern part of Europe. And if you look at the green, that is Islam. That is all what was used to be, a lot of that used to be the Ottoman Empire, but it's even bigger than that, the Northern African part particularly. So you can see that the religious distribution of people around the earth hasn't changed in 400 years. That pretty much the same religions that were there then are still dominating those parts of the world today. So you can see the effect of colonialism and these empires on those situations. Now, there's just a tiny place, one little spot on the earth that would be dominantly Jewish, and that was, of course, Israel, you see there. Now, this chart kind of says, the question is, what percent of people say religion is very important in their lives as a function of these different locations? And you can see the colors. The dark blue is the minimum, and all the way over to the dark orange is the maximum. So you look at America, in North America, it's about 53% of the people think religion is important. You look up at Canada, it's only 27%. If you look at Northern Europe, all of those countries are down in the teens and 20s. And Scandinavia, if you look at Russia and China, they're way low. But remember, Russia and China were both atheist communist countries for a while. That probably had something to do with that. If you look at South America, it's very religious, but it's mostly Catholic, Central America. But the most religious parts of the world are the Muslim parts of the world. Egypt, Turkey, Iran, and those countries, Ethiopia, and then India is Hindu. So you can see that the religion is most important in the Islamic world, probably second most in the Catholic world, and the least in the Protestant world. But in the Protestant world, the United States is more religious than the other Protestant countries. So if you look over here on the top right, you see a pie chart, and it says that the percentage-wise, Christians still are the biggest, Muslims are second, Hindus are third, and then all the way down, only 0.2% of the world's population is Jewish. Now, if you look down at the bottom right, you see the growth, the projected growth by the year 2060. And you see the Muslims are growing over twice as fast as the Christians. And so that it's predicted that the major religion of the world will be Muslim within a few years. So let's summarize here. We've seen how religion, trade, and politics were major factors in shaping the world order and what it was when our ancestors started to come into this country. Religious competition between Islam and Christianity started the age of discovery, where all these new inventions were made to make it possible to explore the world. Spain was the first colony to, and those are some of the inventions that we talked about, the caravel ship, the navigational techniques. Then as far as America was concerned, the major player there was Spain, that began to colonize in the 1500s. And their motivations for that colonization were the fear of the Ottoman encroachment in the Christian world, desperate need for sea-based trade routes to Asia, an opportunity to convert Christians to counter the growth of Islam, an opportunity to profit from the colonization of America, and the political and economic competition between Protestant England and Catholic Spain, Portugal, France was particularly responsible, as well as the religious competition between Protestants and Catholics, and later between different Protestant denominations. So there's our colonies, and there's that religious tree you see. So now we're ready to meet our immigrants in the next chapter. So we got one afterthought here. This is a quote from the French writer Jean-Baptiste Alphonse Karr. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So we still have religious competition, certainly. We have Protestant Catholics. If you know, well, recently we had the wars in Ireland between the Protestants and Catholic. The Sunni and Shia Muslims have been fighting for 1,000 years and are still at it in the Middle East. The Orthodox and secular Jews are always at each other right now in Israel. And we have certainly Muslim and Christian. We talk about 9/11, and you talk about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and all that. Then we have Jews and Muslims in the Middle East, the Palestinians versus the Israelis. So there's not much change there. We still have political competition between ourselves and China, ourselves and Russia. And we still have economic competition, mainly between ourselves and China today. And we still have technical breakthroughs that are changing our lives on a daily basis, things like cell phones, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, quantum computing, all sorts of things that we know that how fast things can change. And so we're in for more change, certainly. So now on to Chapter 3, our Virginia ancestors.